Hi, good morning. My name is Mary Randall, and I am a retired administrator with Salinas City Elementary School District. And currently, I'm the education coordinator at the historic Harvey House, or as it's more popularly known, the First Mayor's House. And we're here to talk a little bit today about the early history of Salinas. I don't know if you saw the controversy in the paper about how old is Salinas really? Well, the answer is it's 150. Because Salinas was founded in 1868. Now, we were incorporated in 1874, which is what the controversy was about. But this is the way I look at it. You don't count your birthday from when your birth certificate was issued. You count it from the day you arrived. And that's the same argument you could apply to how old a city is. Anyway, we're going to talk about that and a lot of other things in the next 40 minutes or so. Anita Mason, who was supposed to give the talk after me about the railroad, unfortunately fell and broke her hip, and yesterday evening she had hip replacement surgery. So I'm going to incorporate some of her talk into my talk. So we're going to start out with what was here before. So when Allison Riker and Eugene Sherwood decided to subdivide the land at the Big Bend and the Slough, the only building that was here in what is now Salinas was the halfway house. It was a tavern, a livery stable, and a blacksmith shop. It received its name because of its location at the intersection of the Monterey-Hollister Road and the San Francisco-Los Angeles Road. And it was a very popular spot on a long, dusty, or muddy, depending on the time of the year, trip. So in 1868, Salinas was a pioneer town. It was pretty rough and tumble. So let me show you how it all looked. This is the original map showing Sherwood's and Riker's 27 lots. So Allison Riker owned Rancho Nacional, and Sherwood Rancho Sosal. This is the Big Bend and the Slough that we're talking about. The halfway house was right there. Here's the road coming from Monterey, going up this way. It keeps on going toward San Francisco, or it turns off, it goes off to Old Stage Road, over the hill to Hollister. And then here we have the road coming down from Castroville, meeting up, and we're right here. And so here you see how the city was configured. Whoops, sorry. Oh, that's what's missing. Okay, there was another map in it. Somehow it disappeared. These things happen. So the Monterey Gazette in early 1869 said, Salinas City is now prepared to become a large town, being mapped out and staked out. However, the Pajaronian said, it's just one series of chuck holes, belly deep in sticky adobe in the winter and hub deep in penetrating dust in the summer. The one street of necessity has to be called Main Street. In some remote time, Salinas will be huge, as she's got the land to do it and the slough to drain her one street. We now leave the city if we can find our way out through the mustard fields. So this is Salinas in the mid-70s. So notice the gas lights, the boardwalks, and the macadamized streets. This is 4 years before we were chartered. So the question is, why was Salinas so successful? And there are several reasons. One is that it was a city of immigrants. We tell the kids who come to the Harvey House that everyone who lives in Salinas came here, or either they or their descendants, from somewhere else. There is no native population of Salinas. The Costanoa moved through here. This was part of their hunting grounds. The rancheros were here, and they farmed this area, and their animals roamed this area. They didn't live in this area. So from the people who put down roots to today, the people who come here are either immigrants, IMM, or international, immigrants, EM, people who've traveled within the United States to come here, or migrants, people like the Costanoa, and the people who came with the Dust Bowl, who were both immigrants and migrants. So the people who came brought a series of skills with them. So you think about not only the people who came from the Midwest and came on the wagon trains and lived in the gold rush country, a lot of them were involved in businesses, involved in city government, involved in establishing communities in Indiana, in Missouri, back, in the areas back east. And even the Chinese who came here as laborers, they came with specific skill sets. They had built the the Transcontinental Railroad. They came with a whole lot of skill sets, as well as a very strong work ethic. The group had strong leadership, and they were smart. They were politically savvy. They knew how to get things done. They were able to come up with a plan to get the county seat moved from Monterey, which was a 100-year-old city, to Salinas, which had like 1,000 people. And they were able to do it by working with San Benito County, which was then part of Monterey County. But the people in Hollister didn't want to be part of Monterey County anymore because it was too far to go to everything. So they worked a deal. They said, you vote for us, we'll vote for you. That's happened before, and it's happened since. And then part of it was just good timing. They were in the right place at the right time. The gold rush was just ending, the big push, the fields were playing out. The Civil War was over. People were looking for a new start in a new place. And it was just, the time was right. The women also contributed to the success. If you think about it, many of them came west with their husbands and their families by covered wagon, carrying young children or pregnant or both, and walking the 2,500 miles across this country. Many of them had multiple children who they lost. Things that kids don't die from today: influenza, measles, cholera, just the basic flu, pneumonia. They didn't have remedies for it, so they lost those children. These were stalwart women. They were tough. Think about it. They had cooked over campfires. They'd worn the same clothes for weeks. They had slept on the ground for months, and they had left their families and friends behind. So both the men and the women were people who had been through the ringer, so to speak, and they were resolute. They were resolute, strong people. So like their men, they had staked everything on creating a better life in the West. So here are some of the landmarks or the hallmarks or the important dates as we look at this time period. In 1868, okay, so the lots went on sale in April of 1868. By June, all the lots of the 27 were sold, and they subdivided additional lots. By September, the school board was formed. And it was a 3-man school board. One of them's job was to get the census report and go out and find out how many kids there were. Another one was asked to procure a location. And they found a house in the 300 block of Main Street, and they said, this will work for us to get started. And they worked, and the other one was to find a teacher, and they found Miss Sophronia Harvey, who was 18, and she had just finished her teacher certificate in Sacramento right before they moved here. And by October, they had their first class open with 9 children, including Sophronia Harvey's little sister, Mabel. And by the next year, they had 60 students. Wow. And by the next year, 120. So in 1870, the volunteer fire department started. And if you're going to have a town, you need a fire department. In 1871, East End opened. East End was the first school, and it was located over where Hayward Lumber is now. At that time, remember, there was no train yet. And so it didn't affect them. That was a school until 1923, when it was so riddled with termites that they tore it down and built Lincoln. In 1872, Salinas became the county seat, and that's what we were just talking about, how Salinas worked that deal with San Benito. In 1872, the same time we became the county seat, the Board of Supervisors authorized Salinas to establish a Board of Trustees and to elect a president, which they did. So in 1874, when the charter eventually got here from Sacramento, all that happened was the Board of Trustees became the city council and the president became the mayor. In 1872, the first passenger train arrived. In 1874, the streets were macadamized, or it's an earlier form of what we call paving today. In 1874, they also got natural gas, and it went to both the street lights and to the homes. In 1874, they got running water to all the homes from deep wells, and they also opened the first brewery. The Salinas Brewery was quite well known, and it was located where the Pepsi bottling plant is, or warehouse, right in that area. The building, the beautiful big Victorian where Victory Mission has their facility now, that was the manager's house. So, by 1880, this is what the history of Monterey County says about Salinas. And this is 12 years after they started building. Salinas is a central place for business for the whole valley. It is directly on the line of the Great Southern Railroad. The population of Salinas City by census of 1880 has grown to 865 inhabitants. Its main street is admirably macadamized, built on both sides in fine city fashion, while the whole town is supplied with gas and water. It has all the facilities for the arts, sciences, convenience, and benefits expected in connection with such a place. Its county buildings, churches, schools, hotels, stores, shops, and residences cause it to rank among the finest of its size in the state. The town is embowered with trees and adorned with pleasant gardens and lovely flowers. The aspect as a whole is that of a true, enterprising, progressive, permanent American city. So quite an accomplishment to make that much progress in that few years. Now let's take a look at some of the aspects of this new town. So first up is transportation. So the stagecoach ran through here long before Salinas, when the halfway house was here. And it continued to run even after the train came, because the stagecoach went places that the train didn't go. And until automobiles became popular or common, the stagecoach continued to be very much part of life in Salinas. But trains did make a huge difference in the potential of Salinas. So we're going to look at a couple of legends. Popular legend says that I.J. Harvey knew Leland Stanford from their gold rush days. Maybe yes, maybe no. We don't have any proof. It also says that he and others encouraged Stanford to put the railroad in Salinas. Could be, but that's not the main reason the train came here. So I'm going to share this map. That's the magic stick though. Okay. So the train was up here in Gilroy, and then it came down to Pajaro in June of 1872. At the same time, they were building a line here over to Hollister with the idea that they could come this way to Salinas and then to Pinoche and over to the Big Valley. Well, they got to Tres Pinos and realized they weren't going that way. It was just too hard. It was too hard to get permits or to get the soil they needed, the land they needed, and it was just too rugged. So they said, well, we're going to persevere, put all our emphasis on this valley route. So they came to Castroville. And in September 72, when they came to Castroville, there was a big party. Everybody was excited. They wanted to go to Santa Rita, a little bit north of here, but they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't is because of something called undivided inheritance. So what happened was that the lady who owned that rancho had several children. Her husband had died. She now, with her children, owns the land. It cannot be divided. She owns half. Her children own equivalent pieces of the other half. Well, what they were doing was the kids were selling pieces of land that didn't belong to them. They kind of did, but not really. And so they were selling these pieces of land. So when the railroad came now and they want to buy land to go through there, nobody knows who belongs to what. The titles are very, very muddy. So whenever the Southern Pacific could avoid going through a rancho with undivided inheritance, they avoided it, which is why they came to Salinas.
Who were they?
Huh?
Who were they? Kids?
I don't know. I don't remember their last name. But Anita Mason could tell us, because she would know. So the next question would be, did Eugene Sherwood give the land for the train station and the right-of-way through Salinas? Yes, and well, not really. He sold, so this is where we are today. This was called Bremen Park. There was a little lake out here, just out there where the old Sizzler building is. And we're like right here. So he sold the lot in Bremen Park for $1 for the building of the train station. But he also owned all these green swatches. Actually, he owned all the yellow ones. And he sold those at market rate. So what about the story that the train ran off the tracks the first time that it arrived in Salinas, and that there was this big party? And what did Jeanette Cockrell really remember? If you go to the first mayor's house, you'll see a picture of a young lady, and beside it is this information. And it says, on November 7th, 1872, the day the first train was to come to Salinas, was an exciting one. None in the village any more excited than pretty Miss Jeanette Cockrell, 16 years of age. She's interviewed in 1835. And so she's now more than 60 years, and she's being asked to remember something that happened when she was 16. So it turns out that she was remembering 3 different occasions and putting them into one good story. But that's the way history goes sometimes. So when the construction train first reached Salinas, there was great excitement. And a lot of people came out to see that. When the first passenger train arrived, it was not a big deal. It was September 1872. It was like, okay, the construction trains are still coming, but now we have a passenger train. This is cool. We're happy. When the train ran off the track was on a Monday morning. So on Sunday, someone flipped the switch, and instead of the train staying on the main track, it went over into the siding, and the siding didn't go anywhere. But the engineer was not expecting to go into the siding, and so he went off the end and the train crashed. So it's 3 stories in one. So is a mural correct? This is a John Cerny mural that you see as you go under the underpass onto North Main Street. Yes, and not quite, because there was an accident and it did involve a train. It was not this cute little train. It was a construction train, but so it's kind of true. Here we have some of the trains that plied this route. The large one, the Governor Stanford, was used. There were a lot of those, and they used them a lot for construction. So they would use it to bring ballast and the timbers and the steel girders down and where they were building the train. And then on their way back, they would take back grain. They would fill up all that space with grain from Salinas Valley, take it back, drop it off in San Francisco, turn around, come back again. So the impact of the train in agriculture was huge, because now the farmers there could produce crops and send them out. So the sequence was, first this area had cattle from the rancho days until about 1850s, and then they started putting in grain, mostly wheat. And wheat did really well. They were able to produce 500 barrels of white flour a day from wheat from this area. Klaus Spreckels and his group came in late 1890s with the idea that let's put in sugar beets. They'd also developed irrigation, and you could water, get water on these sugar beets, and he would build this factory, and we would have It would be great. And it was. So Klaus Spreckle built the Spreckle Sugar Factory 1899. They started producing sugar, and that went on for quite a while. But then he invited Japanese workers to come here because there weren't enough farm labor, and they brought people from Japan to come and start working. And then after the Spanish-American War, people from the Philippines could come here to work without a visa because the Philippines was a protectorate, was a territory. So people came here looking again for a better way of life. And those farm workers who came here brought with them their set of skills, which was how to grow vegetables. And they started growing vegetables in their plots, saving their money, buying a little farm, growing vegetables, and then on the weekends they would go sell them in the markets. And they were doing very well. And all of a sudden, some of the bigger farmers are going, wait a minute, look how well these farmers are doing selling vegetables. And about that time, refrigeration for train cars came in, and we're like, you know what, we could produce lots of vegetables and send them to wherever we want in the United States. And here we are today with lettuce capital of the world. This is the Sperry flour mill. It was, this is why John Steinbeck's father came here, was to manage that mill. And as I said, 500 barrels of white flour a day came out of that mill.
Mary, where was that located?
Right down here, where the granary building is now. It was part of that complex. It looks kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So if you're gonna have industry, you need housing. The oldest house, or one of the oldest houses in Salinas, and the only house that remains from the 1868 period is the first mayor's house, or the historic Harvey House. And it's located just at the far end of this parking lot. Originally, it was at the corner of East Gavilan and Monterey Street. And the house stayed there from 1868 till the late 1930s. By then, the town had grown up around it. And the Harveys, who are now the Bakers, said, you know what? We don't like living in the middle of downtown. So they put their house on a big wagon and moved it to Rummy Lane, where it stayed until 1999. In 1999, with the assistance of the city, we were able to move the house from there down here, where we pay $1 rent per year to the city and are able to serve well over 1,000 students a year who come there to learn about local history and about the westward movement. Another style of house that was popular in those early days was Italiante. And this is the Massengills house. It was on Central Avenue. Victorian style, wasn't quite here yet. Weren't quite up to that stage. So this is our East End School. It was completed in 1871. It was built using a bond paid by the community based on 70 cents per $100 of assessed value. So that doesn't sound like a lot, 70 cents per $100, especially when you bought your lot for $50. But by 1874, East End was not big enough, so West End was built. And the state legislature approved $15,000 for the construction of West End School and a firehouse. And by 1876, the upper floor was opened as a high school. So that was our first high school in Salinas. Now, it should be noted that no Chinese students attended public school, but there's a reason. During the 1880 census, there were over 200 Chinese men and 5 Chinese women. So at that stage, the men were here, they were working. If they had a family, it was in San Francisco or San Jose. Although Salinas became the second largest Chinatown in the United States, right after San Francisco. Gradually, the families would come here, the community would be more integrated, things would change, but in 1880, it wasn't that way. These schools were used till 1923, when East End was full of termites and West End burned down. And by 1881, the school was held for 9 months a year at the expense of $5,428 per year for the school. The cost per student in Salinas City was $1.23 per month. Now it's over $5,428 per child. So books were important too. You have to remember that a lot of these people were contemporaries of Abraham Lincoln. And if you've read stories about Abraham Lincoln, you know what kind of an education he had. The Harveys actually came from the same part of Illinois and Indiana where Abraham Lincoln had grown up. And so they didn't have a deep and rich education for the most part, but they were very well read. They compensated for their lack of education by reading very widely. And new books for the 1880s were Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, Tom Sawyer, Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, and Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. So people would, until the library opened in 1880, the townsfolk would, somebody would buy, a couple people would buy the books, and then you'd read it, and then you'd exchange with your neighbors. And when the ladies got together for tea, they would discuss the books. When families got together for dinner, they would talk about what books they were reading. And that's how, especially the folks who came earlier that didn't get a good education, that's how they built what they knew. So if you have homes, you're going to have institutions. And this is our local volunteer fire department in 1871, ready for action. I love their uniforms. Yeah, well, they probably were.
That would pay the Speedo though.
Yeah. So if another institution was the church, and the Presbyterians organized in December of 1869, and they built their first church building on Pajaro Street in 1874. And although it's gone through several different variations over the years, it is again a church, and it's still in existence. During the next years, the Methodist Episcopal Church, then the Protestant Episcopal Church, aka Anglican or St. Paul's, and the First Baptist Church were quickly formed. The Roman Catholics organized their first church in 1877. Women's club missionary societies were strong, and they raised money for ministries in both the U.S. and foreign. And then benevolent societies for the men were also popular, and Oddfellows and Masons were both started very early in Salinas' history. So you might think, well, what did the women do for work? You know, what was their life like? Well, here are a few of the things that they did. They pumped water. They cooked on a wood stove. They did all the sewing because in the early days there weren't very many stores, and the products in them had been shipped all the way from the East Coast around South America. The laundry, which was done with a washboard and soap and warm water, and you washed the clothes and hung them out to dry, and when they were dry, everything had to be ironed. They took care of the children. They took care of the small animals. And they were also the arbitrators, for the most part, of the social scene. And they were the advocates for education, for etiquette, and for social norms within the community. In a few years, and not even that many, maybe 20, there would be modern conveniences like piped-in water and natural gas for the stove. And for those who could afford it, you could hire help. You could send your clothes to the Chinese laundry, or you could hire a cook to come and work at your house. But not yet. Not in the 1860s. So what was their social life like? Well, in 1868, the new theater was the musical. And the first popular musical was The Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan. And it came to Salinas, or it was staged here in Salinas, and that was a big deal because it's the first musical. Other examples, they had burlesque shows. And those were kind of spoof with sex appeal. And a company would come into town, stay a couple of weeks, and then they would move on to the next town. Then there were extravaganzas, like, I don't know if you've seen The Greatest Showman, but the P.T. Barnum style shows would come into town, and they would stay a few weeks. They had lavish effects, they spooked everyone, and they would do their show, and they would move on. There were also pantomimes and melodramas, often performed around Christmas time and based on tales more for families. And they often included audience participation, like hissing and booing. Then Salinas had an opera house, and they also had ballet there. They had the William Tell Overture, they had Rip Van Winkle, but they also had church choirs, traveling shows, school concerts, and civic events. It's interesting because the newspapers at that time would list who was in each concert and what songs and recitations were sung and were provided. Mabel Harvey talks about the circus coming to town, and they came almost every year, and they pumped water for the elephants in front of their house, and she was always so impressed with that. So then there's the skating rink. So Salinas is 3 years old. It's 1871, and the dads decided, a group of them, that the kids needed something to do. Couldn't skate on the dirt road, so they built a skating rink. A catty corner across this, Monterey Street from where the mayor's house was. And it was a large building with unfinished walls, but good floors, redwood floors. And they had candles in tin holders that were all around the rink. And these are the rules. Gentlemen, will please skate with coats on and hats off. Gentlemen are requested not to smoke or spit on the floor. There will be no loud talking or swearing allowed. They were all directed to the guys. I don't know. So the Salinas Masonic Lodge sponsored a ball at the skating rink. This is like a dance ball, not a skating ball, but $2 a person to raise money for the maintenance of the skating rink. And it was very well attended. Then there's horse racing. They had both you ride on the horse and the harness racing at the racetrack, which is about a mile north of town. The land was provided by Eugene Sherwood, and his only caveat was that there had to be one race a year, at least. Guess what we call it today? Rodeo. It's the whole Sherwood Gardens Rodeo complex. That was the original Salinas racetrack. And there were races all the time. Then there were box socials and outings. People would load up the wagons and they would pile in and go out to Chular Canyon or other favorite spots for picnics. That was a very popular thing to do. They had school functions, recitations, musical concerts. Churches also did that. And there was a lot of home entertainment where the girls would play the piano and everyone would sing along, or the girls would play and people would dance. Dancing, sing-alongs, theatricals. And then bikes were introduced. As soon as the roads were macadamized, people started wanting to have bikes. A big trip would be to go to either the ocean or Paraiso Hot Springs. And if you went to Paraiso, you sometimes went for weeks at a time. And interestingly enough, your visits to these locations were recorded in the local paper. Now, life wasn't all good. There were definitely problems. In 1876, for several years, there was a serious drought. So much so that I.J. Harvey, who had a mercantile store and who, at the beginning of the drought, these guys all know each other. They've all been here together. They've all built the city together. The farmers needed credit. And so he gave them credit. The second year, he gave them credit. And by the third year, he went bankrupt and he lost his store. But that's what happens when you have a drought in this part of the world and it goes on for year after year. Another one was typhoid. In the beginning, they were digging 10 to 12 foot wells. And so the water was contaminated by the slough runoff and other things. And typhoid was rampant in Salinas in 1869. So the McDougalls had a deep well out of town, and so they started bringing water into town. Sort of like how we buy bottled water today. And they would bring the water in so that people could have fresh, clean water to drink. And pretty soon Salinas, that's when they dug the deep wells and then put in piping to take the water to all the houses. Fluctuating markets are always an issue, and then the farmers felt like the railroad, once it came, took control of the market, and if the farmers had a lot of things to ship, the railroad would raise the price per unit, and so that sucked up the farmers' profits. And then the last one was there were concerns about immigration. Some people felt like there were too many Chinese here. So in the 1880s, they passed an Alien Act that prohibited the importation or the Chinese from coming to the United States. And then the Japanese started to come. And then there were strictures on how many Japanese could come per year. And then the Filipinos started coming in. We couldn't do anything to control that because it was U.S. territory. So always through the years, immigration has been an issue in this valley. So some people say, well, how come Salinas isn't more like Monterey? They're so different from each other. Well, if you think about it, Monterey was started in 1770. Salinas was started in 1868, so 98 years later. Monterey was started by the Spaniards or people coming from Mexico. Spanish speaking, that culture. The people who started Salinas were mostly people who'd come from the American Midwest and sometimes from the American South. Totally different worldview. They're mostly Protestant. They're English speaking. Who else came to live here and there? Monterey, the other people who came, Italian, Japanese fishermen, Portuguese, often, again, more Catholic oriented, more Southern European in the case of Italian and Portuguese. Salinas, who else came? Well, all the groups we were talking about earlier. And then major industries. Monterey looked out to the ocean and to tourism. So they had major fishing, major tourism. We were always, from the day one, Salinas has been agriculture, agriculture, and agriculture. So that's why those two cities have never been alike and they never will be alike. And that's okay. So Pete mentioned this little tidbit because I think it's just fascinating that during the Great Depression in 1924 specifically, Salinas was the wealthiest city per capita in the United States. And that's a real tribute to the power or the importance of our agriculture here in this valley. So we owe a huge debt to people like Isaac and Sophronia Harvey. Isaac was our first mayor, Sophronia was our first teacher. And people like Wellington Lee, who was the de facto mayor of Chinatown. And to all the migrants and immigrants and people who have worked together to make Salinas the kind of city it is today. It's taken all of their contributions. I hope that sometime today you'll go out and walk around the main stage, and there's some panels there that were created specifically for this event with a grant from the Founders Day Committee to the Historic Harvey House. And they depict all the immigrant groups who've come here over the years. And we think it's important that we remember that we all are part of our past and we're all part of our future. Are there any questions? All right, come on. Somebody's got a question.
When you talked about the schools, you talked about there not being Chinese in them. Were there other ethnicities besides white students in those schools? There
really weren't any. If you look at the census in 1880, there was one black family, the Coopers, but they didn't live in the city. They lived out on where, you know where Cooper Road is? That's where their property was. And so their children didn't come here, and there really weren't any other groups here at that time. Yeah.
So you sort of answered my question too, because in the very beginning when you were talking about the pioneers that came over, the strengths of the women and the skills and the strengths that they brought here, and I was thinking about Mexican people in particular, but what their strengths were, but they didn't settle in this area.
There were ranchos, like where the Barandas live, where the Baranda adobe is. The Barandas lived there. And there were other people who were out in some of the rancho areas, and they continued to live in those areas. And they were part of the society. People were intermixed. People worked together, talked together. But if you're looking at just the population of Salinas, it was pretty homogeneous group in 1880.
And that's the reason in Salinas there weren't any Mexican kids in the school.
There weren't. Now, what changed the ethnic mix was the Bracero program. During World War II, the men were gone fighting the war. And some of the work women here could do, a lot of them went to work at the sugar factory. But the field labor, they needed people to come and pick the crops. And so the Bracero program was developed with Mexico. Mexico was neutral in the war, but they wanted to make a contribution. And so they helped set up that program that brought thousands and like 10,000 workers here. They did over $4 million in contracts during the Bracero program. It was a huge, huge program, and it made a big difference, both in our ability to sustain our agriculture during the war and in the years afterward, and also in what Salinas looks like today. So, yeah.
Was the Opera House opera like we consider it?
Yes, it was.
And was that also where all of the other entertainment sort of used that facility?
It was next door to what became the Caminos Hotel. It was the American Hotel first, and then it became the Caminos Hotel, and the Opera House was next door.
Okay.
And downstairs was a livery stable. Yeah.
So that would be where Maya Cinema is now?
Other side of the street, kind of next door where the Taylor building is now.
Okay.
Any other questions? We have such a wonderful history in this town. And I've only lived here 30-something years, but it's intriguing, it's interesting. There's just so much to be learned and learn from, not only about our ancestors here, but from them, because they have a lot to teach us.
Thank you.